Hello everyone, today we talk about Celtic metallurgy, blades, and the influence of the same in Romano-Germanic warfare. This is essentially a history of military culture video that can be coupled with several different ones I already made, especially about Celtic warfare, but not only, right? Because we'll have to delve into late antiquity, migration era, soon again, right, talking more about the Roman army, about Germanic warfare. As you know, the Celts had been dramatically influential as far as the hardware of these military forces, and they had, however, relatively disappeared or had been subsumed by the same. And it's important to look both at, in fact, the origins, right, how the Romans and the Germans definitely were influenced by Celtic metallurgy, arms, armor, and also how this, say, knowledge somehow survived within the same and was even revived further in early medieval warfare for reasons that are not strictly technological, but that can help, in fact, to understand better the background, right, of this hardware and the very nature of Celtic politics and society and warfare as a consequence. So in this video I will not discuss, for example, the use of iron spreading to Europe around the 8th century BC. I want to make another video about that, and in general about metallurgy in the Iron Age as far as especially arms and armor are concerned. This video will not even specifically look at other quantitative statistic data that would be very useful, right, to appreciate especially the quality, for example, of Roman weaponry and armor compared to the Celtic one, and the survival of the same quality within the Roman army until the meeting with the Germans that also had been influenced by, at that point, both the Celts and the Romans in turn, but with this also sort of Celtic element returning from the same Roman one. And the general affirmation of certain types of swords during the migration era as opposed to previous centuries, right, in similarities, the differences, and so on. Because I'm not aware of a work that covers entirely like a monograph on this very topic as a whole, right? Of course, there are lots of studies on these topics individually, but this analysis fits more, again, a sort of broader strategic logic and a sociological one. So it's really introductory, and I propose myself to really look into all the various branches in individual videos, because otherwise we would never stop talking today. As always, actually, given the topics I usually undertake to discuss, nevertheless, you can always check, as you know, out my Celtic Warfare playlist, and I plan to replenish that with new videos soon as well. So there is, first of all, a question one should pose. Like, given the picture that the Iron Age warfare, right, in Europe is presenting us with. As you know, I recently made a series about Roman archaic warfare, and we observed how, let's say, the Celto-Italic arms and armor were fundamentally very similar in origin, right, around these very centuries. And one could go as far as saying, as some scholars do even, that there was even more of a sort of Mediterranean influence on the Celtic tribes than the other way around, which is something I will not specifically discuss today. Of course, I believe that the Celts were actually more influential as far as their arms and armor in say for especially what the Roman military would generalize and systematize on the basis of their knowledge and techniques. But there is always the problem of where also did the Central European populations, including, I don't know, even the same Proto-Indo-Europeans, the same Italics before migrating in the peninsula, get their technology from, right? What are the paths that these peoples followed? And naturally, it's very complicated because we look at ages so far, but especially so primitive, right? So prehistorical as far as at least written documents are concerned, that it's just guessing and or looking at also, of course, especially the archaeological evidence, and realizing, first of all, as we'll see also a bit better later, that there was a massive influence as far as European warfare was concerned. Yes, from a general greater technological development of the Mediterranean, and especially the Levant, right, that at this point was, providing essentially with the most advanced military in the world, but also these steps. And this aspect is crucial for two reasons. One is comparative. The fact that also as far as medieval warfare goes, for a long time we thought that, say, the Eastern influence as far as just, however, a Southeastern influence, a Middle Eastern one, a sort of Islamic one, was so crucial during the Crusades to boost Western technology. And the more time passes, and the least this seems to be the case, historically speaking. Whereas we are reevaluating, of course, not denying even influences from the other side, but also realizing that we're very often developments in parallel, right? I personally don't think that Western Europe was particularly, let's say, underdeveloped, for example, from a technological point of view in the early and the high Middle Ages, especially as far as military hardware was concerned, which is also in part connected with today's topic. But it's evident that the steppes peoples kept hitting, let's say, the European cemeteries for millennia, right, from a direction that fundamentally molded ever more a certain type of military culture that is more or less what we can identify also with the broader Central European one of the Celts, and later even of the Germanic peoples. And regarding this topic, I also made a video about swords in Romano-Germanic culture, both from a sort of a mystical but also technical point of view, and we will come back on that topic prepotently. Influences are fine. One has to understand also why certain techniques, certain technologies are adopted eventually. Right. For example, the deterministic idea that the most skilled in the arts of the forge became those peoples settled in places rich in minerals is readily evident wrong, right? Because even though the Celts had surely some of the best mineral resources out there, the say evidence of sort of more developed weaponry and armor does not quite originally stem just from them per se, right? For example, the coat of mail as such, we think about the later Lorica Amata also saying that this is what the Romans got from the Celts, whatever. Actually, some of the earliest evidence is Etruscan, right? And even that could actually predate all the Celtic other ones, as much as we find actually an Eastern influence, even in the same Celtic world. It's seemingly the ones from, say, bordering the Scythians that had sort of this earlier insight, all right? There is also sort of apological concept here to think that, as we'll see now, the theme is the following: that the Celts were the ones that developed most this kind of armor sort of finesse, right? As far as the exemplars that we have and the history of it, etc., provides us. But there were surely places that had a more advanced metallurgy or even better weaponry that did not use swords, armor, the same way, for example, the Celts did. And this makes it very fascinating. As much as some others actually adopted, including the Romans, Celtic designs, etc. The other aspect is also, are we sure that actually this, say, we can speak for times so ancient and peoples so close and similar, all right, like the ones in Europe and also the Mediterranean. You could simply say, well, say, weapons technology actually had was considered to a point for which there was a mythology revolving around this blade superiority just per se, and how much can we actually document from a quantitative statistic point of view about how, for example, these weapons were used, because you can even make the best weapons, and the Celts did, right? But how many of their troops, for example, would be able to use these weapons? And this is a topic I already analyzed recently, just that came in sequence randomly from the cycle about the Celtic infantry and Gallic war bands from the 4th to the 2nd to the 1st century BC, right? And there is the question, the famous passage from Polybius that said that Celtic swords bent themselves because they were not qualitative enough, and that is not really one of my favorite passages, because Polybius was a very smart individual, and he provided us with an amount of information that I think a minimal part of world population today can contribute equally to in any other field of civilization. He's a person that was really writing our own modern language, and that's the extent to which we are the children of the Greeks, intellectually speaking. But, of course, the guy was writing, first of all, to praise the Romans in many ways, and you know that I have actually a very confident opinion after decades of learning about this topic. So, of course, there was hardly much that the Celts as a military culture could, essentially claim above the Romans. Also, in the early days, which is something that somehow still creeps from the some sort of unsatisfied groups, right? For reasons that I will not make my usual digression on. But we know also that the Celts had specific rituals for which they bent their own swords, for funeral burials, and of course there were some, presumably even the majority of Celtic swords, like presumably the majority of the swords in any broader culture, army, etc., were of relatively low quality, right? And that just fast for the Middle Ages, and what we understand even just about sword making in this case, we talk mostly about swords, right? For one excellent sword, there would have been, I don't know, 8 or 9 that were like meh. And this is something astonishing, by the way, because the beauty of this all is that even though we are far beyond the technology that these guys had, the qualities of steel, as we will see now, etc., the various, let's say, engineering accomplishments that we have reached, these guys knew how to make swords that ergonomically are dramatically more advanced than anything that we can hope to replicate. And especially, we do not have the palest idea of how they managed to achieve that, because we have the swords actually from those times. There are very thorough metallographical analysis carried out of them, but this doesn't actually tell us how these swords were actually made, right? There is a lot actually of material regarding war, regarding the way, of course, the same weapons were produced, that there are lots of tales. We've seen it even just on the videos about Germanic swords and beyond. But the actual way they made them, we do not actually know. As for most things, even concerning their warfare concretely, right, it's just conjectures, right? At best, some more valid than others, but still hypothesis. So the mineral availability, that's an important element. There is no doubt that France, and above all the Rhine Basin, still today are among the world's largest producers of iron. Right, still today, France and Germany, of course, in their industrial capacity in Europe, reflect in part the natural resources of these countries once inhabited by the Celts. And some of the same mines were used at the time, or actually, say, the areas at least, the single localities are used today. Right, this is true for, I don't know, some marble mines in Italy from Roman times, etc. There are these kind of continuities throughout history. That's not enough, even just to claim, oh, well, okay, well, that equates, right, a greater availability just at the time. Mining costs, say, mining technologies that I will not digress on, were evolving over time. The Hellenistic Roman world was more advanced in that. So these are all factors that alone, just given that we do not have, of course, any precise or even, just generic data about the quantities involved, if not, again, even this case speculatively, we can't imagine not being, again, a dramatically relevant factor. For the reason the Celts could have such good weapons, right? The Celts were, of course, as we know, contiguous to the Germans that were essentially descending from the north, essentially from Scandinavia, and pushing the same Celts away from Central Europe and gradually taking them over. We have described this dynamic. Maybe the early Germanic migrations, not so much, but say the relation between the Germans and the Celts that, aside from the fact of being quite complicated to specifically delineate, because these are broader ethnographical terms that have barely much to do with how these peoples also saw themselves primarily, was complicated by the fact that they were hostile against one another, because mostly even the single Celts and the single Germans were normally at war, right? Tribe against tribe. This is a first indicator, of course, where I'm getting to, which is not, however, and banally the point for now, that is to say, of course, that these were warlike peoples, and as such, they would produce, a well-tested equipment, except this still does not explain the issue, because there were lots of peoples who were constantly warring and didn't have particularly advanced metallurgy and or even aside from the accessibility to arms and armor just per se, and nor the same types of weapons, right? So that doesn't quite explain the thing per se either. Right, and again, distinguishing the Celts from the Germans is not that easy, except for one, say, if we pick the extremes, right? At least the Celts were at the peak of their civilizational development, and particularly, and it depends, at least for the areas, again, especially in Gaul, in Central Europe, etc. They were a florid culture, right? They had reached essentially proto-urbanization. They had extensive and long-scale trade contacts. They were quite warlike. They migrated, covering from Central Europe very far distances, from Ireland to Asia Minor, from Spain to the Black Sea. So you have there really a lot going on, and of course the fringes were actually some of the most underdeveloped places in Europe at the time, but the core, right, especially this sort of approximately Franco-German, we can say, just in a modern sense, heartland, especially the German part in the south, so towards especially the Danube, right, the greater routes of communications, etc., were more Pacific than the Germanic world. They were essentially displaying some traits of significant social stratification, also of, in fact, gradual loss of military quality that at that point was not particularly high. Probably the Celts are very overestimated in the later times as far as their military capacities are, but they're very underestimated in the earlier times, right? As if they had been the Germans of the early Germans of the later situation, right? And and even for the Germans, that it's not that they were just per se in terms of political cohesion particularly effective in of themselves, but this is an important aspect to realize, because essentially the Celtic world was eventually taken over by the Romans, whereas the Germans were kept out. And the Germans were much more traumatically and brutally primitive than the Celts, right? Of course, in between you couldn't quite distinguish them that clearly, but it's also quite evident that they were opposite to one another largely, that the Germanic migrations caused in Central Europe some significant destruction and decline of actually significant Celtic accomplishments. If you look especially at the Boiaenum, the land of the boy, this was a florid place until essentially the Marcomannic kicked in and turned it. That the Oppida collapsed, the international, they imported precious metals from the Iberian Peninsula. This ceases to be. And naturally, the Roman world instead brings to something much more developed. And so from there on, we see rather the sense that the German is the terrible warlike sort of barbarian outside. And actually after, this was a thing, especially after the Weimarian propaganda, right, that having crushed the Cimbri, the Teutonists, etc., was much reduced with Caesar's defeat of Ariovistus and his bloody raids into Germany that effectively served as a deterrent for essentially any further Germanic expansion towards those lands. And in fact, it would take half of a millennium before the Germans posed any concrete threat, and just as allies that were let in by the Romans at some point in a time in which they were surely opposite to the Romans, but heavily Romanized even in their own military culture, both having received a lot from the Celts. So the point being that even after the Battle of the Tudor Force, it was understood these primitives were not particular. They were really a prehistoric people. Like Augustus Germans were really the warriors with clubs, with stone heads, spear heads, all these kind of things. And only gradually they even came close to what the Celts had been prior. Of course, Germanic chieftains had an equipment that surely the average Celt would have envied. But generally speaking, they were much poorer materially, and yet they were morally superior to the Celts. Right? They were more cohesive than them, and just more intensely warlike, enough to essentially even cross Gaul without any problem, sending the signal to the Romans that the Celtic world was just a fruit rather to be collected. And the story, generally speaking, right? What we see in between is a gray area in which we can't even say technically what is Celtic and what is German, right? There were large areas of mixed culture. Sometimes we literally do not know whether entire peoples were Celtic or Germans. This is the case, for example, of the Bastarnae, that were, in spite of being surely a Celto-Germanic hybrid and also one with other populations, a more, say, evidently Germanic one, right? That, however, the Romans called Gauls or Galatians, like they would normally do with a sense of Celt of Gaul. That stems from the war bands, right? Just like in Gaelic, etc. The root being, the foreigner intended as the warbander, right? As the guy that must roam the world seeking for fortune, springing out of divine force and gaining, right, ordering the world as such. I made a bit about the Romano-Germanic concept of the age of order that, in fact, all these peoples and others really shared. It is true that the Germans and the Celts had a substantial spiritual and material commonality. Right nowadays, the sense is that essentially the Celts and the Germans are the anti-modernity. Right? They are sort of pop culture fact made as a sort of anti-state, anti-establishment concept. Of course, these were peoples that had as their sole identity the right of the stronger ruling over the weaker, as a matter of fact. And it's really despicable how people identify with them, by ignoring completely actually the very beautiful ideal that they believed, also because the entire world believed exactly the same thing. Of course, I will not digress again on the usual religion of the lesser people, but always remind that that's an insult to these populations that would have allegedly taken like 95% of those who whine about, the Romans having conquered these peoples and massacred them themselves, because, of course, they have absolutely nothing to do with them. And would be morally, culturally, and personally disgusted by the same individuals. There is the sense of naturalism. This are all stuff that was born like in the 19th, 20th century. There was nothing to actually show that these populations had a sort of more or less pronounced sense, for example, of naturalism or environmentalism than say the other peoples like the Greeks or the Romans. There is, however, an interesting evidence that I actually say it's not a mystery for anyone, but in my videos I began to collect that distinguish significantly the different stages in which these peoples found themselves at a point. That is to say that the Celts display a much more chthonic character than the Germans, right? For reasons that I can't quite simply digress on, but the sense being that what we call the Celts, and also especially in the western fringe of Europe, had been mixed with at least they had been struggling with a much depending on the areas, right? But a much greater amount of pre-Indo-European populations that in part they exterminated, in part they brought down, but also and especially in the most populated areas like Gaul, they fundamentally blended with, and that somehow diluted the originally Apollonian, Uranian, heavenly, celestial, divine, virile element into that, right? If you look at, for example, the female presence in Celtic, this is in part true also for the Germanic one, because of course in the fringes of Europe something similar happened in that regard. Actually, there are some sort of mystics that believe something different regarding the origins of the Indo-Europeans in general, but today we stick rather to the Kurganic hypothesis. There would be actually a lot to say about that, because it's all much more blurred than it seems. But there is no doubt either that, for example, the presence of the feminine, chthonic, Pelasgian, telluric, inferic element is much stronger in these cultures than, say, the more sort of Apollonian ones of Hellas or Rome, and some of other peoples, including the Vedas, for example, the Iranian mythology, and so on. Part of the reason is, again, in my opinion, this dilution demographically. At least one of great resistance from, say, peoples who were, of course, inhabiting the opposite side of the continent compared to ones from which the Indo-Europeans arrived. In part, it could be, let's say, the more precarious political and social structures of these peoples. And so the fact that warfare seemed a much more incumbent reality, that the level of misery and eschatological decline was much more readily evident to these peoples. But especially for example, populations like the Gauls, and especially in the most florid, developed areas, were also the softest from a military point of view, compared to even just, say, the Belgians, right? They were sort of Celtic-Germanic, or at least they wanted to themselves to consider more like Germans, as the Romans say, rather than Gallic at that point. Were in their art, in their, say, their iconography in general, a lot about the earth and not heaven and not the sky. And in parallel, we also see that differently, basically from all the other Indo-European mythologies, the Celtic one does not, at least as a trace of what has arrived to us, it doesn't display a particular centrality of a god fatherly figure, right? There is an Apollo. There are also in the Gaelic mythology, of course, references to the sacred, essentially the Sol Invictus, the sacred king, etc. But always in the sense of a sort of the generation of fall, etc. This doesn't mean that the originary Celts, because this is the other belief that matured over time, were sort of, less into those ideologies than, let's say, Uranian, Apollonian ones that, in fact, they displayed, especially at the beginning with eagles, etc. But that, of course, they had a more limited load of spread compared to the original Indo-Europeans in areas that were also substantially populated, and so in those areas they were somehow taken over more by the local chthonic dimension, right? There is a lot of this also in the same Druidic phase. Of course, we can imagine this knowledge being quite buried. The traditions were, of course, bearing a lot of that sense of solar deity, but we also find a much more pronounced chthonic dimension than, say, even among the Germans. In part, again, it can be that the Indo-Europeans coming from the east somehow impacted more Central as opposed to Western Europe. It may be that, of course, the Greeks and the Romans also were able to, through their cultures, through different stages of development and imitation and cultural influences from, say, the Persian Empire, Alexander, etc., to revive, and this is especially the case of Rome, the most radically Apollonian element that actually lays exactly into, of all, right, aside from the Vedas, if we're talking about the West, this definitely lays in the Dorians, right? The Dorians are the one, and likely this happened because the Indo-Europeans who settled in Southern Europe, of course, were the biggest winners of all, right? They conquered the best places, the more advanced ones. They felt like this was the greatest accomplishment. They were the more blessed by divine glory, etc. Of course, living in Central Europe or in Scandinavia was, something slightly different as a sense of accomplishment, and that greater, and from groups that initially may have actually been weaker. This is very important to stress. So, even though, again, in pop culture we think that, oh my god, it was about the Celts and Germans that had that ultra sort of tribal, warlike thing, etc., that it was so much like the spring of the Indo-European. Actually not, right? You have to look at the actual springs and who eventually went where and what happened in those places to to appreciate what happened during the Indo-European migrations that, as you know, are also largely, undocumented, right? So it's a huge topic, and I can't quite simply address it on my own. But again, the sense of tiredness of the Celtic world on the eve of the Roman and Germanic conquests is something that must be taken very seriously into consideration. And that, again, speaks also of the non-exactly flattering military quality of the Celts by that point, with the exception of few peoples, like, say, the Galatians were not really a threat for their neighbors. They displayed some sort of, maybe, it's not much about the Hellenistic influences, but for example, they could field substantial amount of Scythic chariots fighting even against the Seleucids, but truly the tougher Celts were the Belgians and the Helvetii, right? This is fundamentally it. The rest, the British ones were actually likely, and the most underdeveloped in many ways. They were the ones who maintained for a longer time the heroic ethos for what it meant, the territory, right? Even though you can argue the Belgians, for example, did too, yes, but they were much more politically cohesed than, say, the Central Gauls, and stronger definitely than the Brittonic Celts. There are also the Celtiberians, but we will talk about them soon. I also made a video about Iberian warfare in general last spring that somehow addresses part of these issues as well. The Danubian Celts, in my opinion, are very underappreciated in general. I would say in pop culture. I made a video about the Skordiski. If you look at the Pannonians, as much as actually the Cantabrians in the north of Spain, they took tens of imperial legions, right, to be taken down, right? Just they were more politically fragmented, really, and scattered. We do not have an evidence there for any major force that they had quite developed. Also because the bigger deal were the Dacians, that were a true kingdom and something, in fact, that we will see hopefully soon as well. Also from a military point of view, from what we can understand, they were not dramatically different at all, right? But again, political cohesion is also, it's not even about arms and armor, right? That were very, very similar, and the same goes with the Romans, or with basically any other century people in Europe. But the difference of moral kind is always the most interesting historically, right? This would also fit the idea that, let's say, a more technologically advanced world is often also in a stage of advanced moral decadence, at least if taking technology in such a reliant fashion, especially when this technology is very advanced, but it can be used by very few. And this seems to be the case of the Celts, right? Initially, they would know how to exploit metallurgy to some, say, the age of Celtic expansion in very effective ways, but then things began to go somehow under. I don't know, even the Roman Empire in the 6th century was, for example, having a technological revival, but aside from Justinian's reconquest, it was due also to the non-particularly prosper condition in which other peoples in Mediterranean and Europe lived. Still somehow is distant from the time the Romans were objectively a primitive people compared to the other Mediterranean ones, had managed, in fact, to take over the entire Hellenistic world, and also profitably using some technological limitation, even from the Celtic world, to actually take the latter over without actually much of an overall problem. So this could be an interesting key of interpretation, right? There is a similarity between the Celts and the Germans. it would be rash to assume some degree of immediate identity at the basis of it, because these were peoples that had somehow already separated in different branches from Proto-Indo-European times. But again, they were all pretty similar. They lived all, fairly close, and they had lots of exchanges, the same with actually the Mediterranean. So let's not exaggerate with categorizations either, right? And there is a distinct evidence that the Germanic culture, of course, matured after the Celtic one, proves it. Paradoxically, it's the Celts that somehow championed warriorism more than the Germans did. This is a clear impression that I received if we, of course, distinguish the two people's sort of chronologies as they came into play, like at least under the light of history, while other peoples finally documenting us. And of course, the Germans are much more famous in this regard because they were exposed for a much longer time to the description by other peoples until they developed a literature themselves, whereas the Celts were not, which doesn't mean that, again, they had not undergone the same level, stages of development the Germans did, except the stages are never quite like a standard pack that you have to somehow unblock depending on which kind of level you reach. This happens while the art of war is actually developing in the world. So there was never a time in which literally the Celts were at the same stage that the Germans would have arrived at some point, because the Germans also saw the world through a somehow more advanced lens later on than the Celts did. Right? The true, paradoxically again, the same concept of warrior beast, etc., may have not be well documented, like for the Germans during the migration or the Viking eras, but it was probably much more deeply ingrained at the beginning than when the Germans came around. Germans that managed, by the way, to defeat the Celts because they were apparently more sort of cohesive, right? And in this sense, cohesively drilled than the Celts were when it got down to maintaining, for example, a formation on the battlefield, stereotypically at least. And this may be a bit unfair. The Germans are described, for example, by the Romans, say, withdrawing in some good order, pulling their casualties away from the field whenever, if they were not broken, as any army really does. Whereas the Celts are represented as, again, the guys that place everything on the first charge, and then they literally broke, right? This was actually done in different dimensions by actually every people, but even and more closely by the Germans, because they were really very similar. Except, again, the sense is that the Germans were the more pressed, the one really having to break through more desperately, not having less land from the north, or less resources to live in there in the first place, and so forcing their way against this other, not exactly tender-hearted, Central European populations that truly welcomed them, in arms, but were also crushed by these more primitive peoples in turn, right? That, in particular, Germanic metallurgy is indebted to the Celtic one seems to be attested by really a lot, including, for example, linguistic evidence. The Germanic terms, for example, indicating iron and armor are of Celtic origin, right? Naturally, if we look at, say, Latin, Gallic, Germanic, from different origins, we see easily that there are lots of terms that were exchanged from one another, but in different times in history. Here, we see that likely this, aside from the common Indo-European vocabulary roots that were shared practically by all of them as far as these terms were concerned, there may have been some actual mutuation, right, from the more advanced people, right? Just to make an example, the if you look at the early Celtic military vocabulary, well, surely was not motivated from the Romans, because the Romans were just expanding at that point. But if you look at, I don't know, medieval Gaelic military vocabulary, it's full of Latin loans, because obviously at that point, I made a video about the Gaels, the Scots. They also served en masse in the Roman army. So the same goes for the Germans later on. So at that point, it becomes even more complicated to districate oneself from the very origins, again, of peoples that fundamentally did not write, right? And it was not really the Roman conquest fault if they didn't have a literature. And we have to appreciate our own limits in this own regard, right? The endless Ercunia Silva, so essentially Black Forest, that's what it was at the time, covering much of Germany, in fact, with the dense shade of its oaks, offered to the Celts living in the region abundant raw material to the metallurgy of in fact the locals, but also other peoples, including the ones that would settle right there in later times, the Germans. The iron from the hearths, the wood for the forges. It is also significant that in Gothic, the words indicating metal mountain and wooden hill are closely linked, right? And this, again, with Gothic, it's all more complicated to make this kind of analogies, but at the end of the day, the resonance of, because the Goths are a very somehow composite, the most problematic, it's this ethnographic sense of the Germanic peoples, despite being the more prominent and influential. So, but exactly for this reason, we could say they also tended to receive some broader insight from other international situations, like the one that we're going to describe. That notoriously has to do with the Noricum, right? That was essentially during antiquity the most, at least the best supplier of adequately carburized iron for arms and armor production. In fact, around the 5th century BC, the Celts of Noricum apparently discovered the art already glimpsed by the Calibians of the Black Sea of not completely decarburizing the iron, which, as we know, is a dramatically important thing, as it increased the hardness and elasticity of that metal, crucial as far as arms and armor production, especially the blades, was involved. The emigration of the Celts towards the west in different waves, right? That in the most distant part of the Celtic fringes would arrive, in fact, at different time, up to very late, right? There were some Celts that settled, say, in Ireland in the mid first millennium BC, and say at the end of the same, there still were, I don't know, Belgians that knocked at their door, and they were at that point somehow very different people. There is not a, say, a radical concordance of, say, these peoples and entities within each other. Of course, they were particularly jealous of what they had managed to conquer on their own, and in spite of the obvious cultural affinity, they somehow were, again, not very welcoming towards one another. And there were this deep jealousies, hatred, rivalries, conflicts, and so on. In any case, that's how this metallurgical skills spread throughout the Celtic world, not actually, again, achieving the same results, right? But still, all right, proving that the metallurgical insights were part of a broader need, especially from the military elite, to of course, rely on their armament. Thus began the journey towards steel, right? You know that steel has essentially this particularly balanced of iron in a very few points percentage of carbon that the Calbis noricum essentially provided naturally from this, essentially what are today's Austrian mines, from which iron, interestingly enough, is still extracted. That thus helped dramatically, say, in increasing the quality, especially of arms and armor. But that could not quite suffice for the entire system, just per se, right? So the steel appeared somehow early, at least in those markets that could afford to buy that, such as the Gallic ones of the 2nd century BC, that essentially were the most prosperous in the entire Celtic world, and not excessively far from Noricum, of course. And the Romans, too, were very sensitive to the problem of the hardness and elasticity of metals, right? And the sense is that, just at least if we remain within the Italic reality, they had never achieved equal results like those one, right? This is true as far as we find it, at least the finest metallurgical accomplishments in Europe. There were something, again, mostly relegated in that part of Central Europe, then in part the Iberian Peninsula, but again, do not necessarily correspond to the average quality of the weapons that could be fielded by these peoples from a military point of view. So you should not be mistaken for, those guys had better weapons. Even if it had been the case, that's not even remotely close to have any relevance in the outcome of warfare, right? As also the case of, say, the Roman conquest of the Celtic world is concerned, for not talking about the Germanic ones that really came from a unspeakingly primitive material culture that, compared to the Celtic one, was to appear dramatic, to say the least. So again, moral force first and foremost. There is a myth, though, regarding the concept that the Romans would have had, continues to have throughout their own imperial journey, some sort of unavailability of arms and armor quality, right? I don't know whether there are still actually people thinking this historiographically, but the idea is that Rome had, of course, very different challenges to face compared to individual tribes, and in the Celtic case, ever narrower elite that was essentially subjugating them. Rome had an incredibly large military. They had the resources, of course, of maintaining this. They also counted very much on collective training, which is civilization, what actually makes a professional military and the winning one. In many ways, and the standardization of arms and arm production, of course, did bring to some loss in quality overall, right? It's better that, I don't know, an average Roman princeps of the 3rd century BC had a better equipment than de facto its Marian copy in the 1st century BC. The only point being that, of course, the princeps was just one, let's say, type of troop of, say, 1/3 of the Roman heavy infantry. Then there were even better equipped guys that were, however, losing relevance as such in the 2nd century BC. The Triarii and the Astati had a substantially lighter equipment. Eventually, the Romans managed to field this homogeneous legionary infantry based on the princeps model. But it's obvious that at some point the quality of this equipment shall have, and talking probably about the material, technical quality of it. For example, the Lauric Armata at some point extended exactly during the 1st century BC further down, so it covered more. But the idea is, again, that you do not need the finest quality in order to be effective in practice. The reason why these were the same very troops that Caesar led in numerical inferiority in Gaul, taking over in 8 years what would remain for half of a millennium under Rome, and in one of the most unspeakable success of Romanization overall for the history of Gaul, of France later on, I think speaks volume about the actual result. The Romans were not just dramatically loaded professional military that was now leaving in the wake of now centuries of imperial tradition, by the way, but of course their effectiveness laid primarily in what they were able to achieve collectively. And this is not even to say, as we explained, that the individual Roman legionary was, for example, not conceived to be a single swordman, right? They were. But there were a compromise between the two things. A compromise that, in fact, other peoples could not afford, because they were either, again, of the sort of feudal type, or proto-feudal one, like, as we'll see now, the Celts were turning into, or of some broader military that, however, was not motivated enough for political or social reasons to become what the Romans were. Then there is definitely a mystical, spiritual, supernatural dimension that moved all these peoples, and that, of course, the Roman conquest of the world somehow symbolized the most, fulfilling the prophecies of the ancients on the sort of this true golden age restored between the third and the fourth and the last one. So between the fact the Bronze and the Iron Age, matching with essentially Augustan times, and that at this point had barely anything to do with the mysteries now of a chthonic world that technically should have even despised technology and matter, and winning just through moral force and vision, right? According to the religion of all the people involved here. But to go as far as saying that, let's say, the Roman military had some sort of generally poor quality weapons, even lighter ones in the essence compared to the average of these peoples, is ludicrous, to say the least. Not just Rome fielded as the core of her armed forces and as essentially the strongest army in antiquity a consistently armored heavy infantry, but the quality of their weapons was in that very sense, given that, of course, the Roman legionary was primarily a swordman, surely a significantly qualitative armament compared to what the average, in this case Celtic warrior, could field. And this actually requires a very specific effort. Let's balance the thing out. It is true that, of course, for producing this sort of massively produced arms and armor, the Romans began to subcontract this to some, factories. Then they just later during late antiquity, in fact, they began to centralize production, probably from a south direction. The Romans also generally could buy or even make weapons on their own in the legionary camps and so on. And it's obvious that the quality as a whole was not the one of, say, the top quality of the Celtic one. But again, we did have that in the Celtic world as well, right? And this is the other aspect, in fact. How many Celts could afford the finest metallurgical accomplishments, right, as of their people as far as of arms and armor went, right? Very few. And this was evident even in the most developed Gallic world, where essentially a few people controlled most of the land, and as a consequence, the majority of the population, even of the older Celtic Indo-European origin, was essentially peasantry, right? They could have gotten into some sort of raiding lifestyle, but they were fundamentally farmers. All right, and the primary weapon that was used by the Celts, as much as by the Romans, at least in as much as the fact that the majority of their troops overall in their armies was not even Roman, were spears. Right? There is to say, actually, that we think the Roman lanca was used much more frequently, even by the legionary infantry, that may have not even been so uniformly equipped as we think. Right? Because we know really a very few about the Roman army. Right? Don't think that we have the certainty that, in a legion, every single cohort or century was equipped in the same way. Right? There was even an organic disproportion. Usually the first cohort was more robust, but let's say we know a lot of things, including that auxiliaries could even use the finest legionary equipment, also because they were often sent to fight in the stead of the same legionnaires. But the tactical contingencies, in fact, could vary a lot. The fact that the term lorica in Latin derives from the adjective laureus, that means made of leather, of course speaks of older times in which the material culture was even poorer. Right? It would have been pretty similar, even in some context of the Celtic world, in the same time or later on. So it doesn't actually demonstrate anything in terms of, say, a scarce quality of metals. There is also no doubt, by the way, that the Romans wanted to get the better metal available, but this was part of, let's say, an optimum that they could achieve through the fact that the Nordic people had been first allies of Rome, then their subjects, and so simply Rome could draw, if they had to draw from the best metal for the military. It would, of course, get it from the Calbus mines in Noricum. So it makes sense, right? It's not a matter of inferiority, or it would have been pretty dumb actually not to do that, right? This is what we tend to get wrong sort of all the time. For example, the idea that the Roman gladius would have been allegedly a copy of the Celtic one, just like any other thing. This is not the thing. First of all, gladius is, of course, a generic term, just the one for sword, right? But and we've seen it in Roman archaic warfare, in Celtic warfare of the same time, in Italy, where the Celts and the Romans fought, that the size of spearheads, of blades, was pretty much the same. So actually, when we look at what the Romans started doing from the 3rd century BC, when they also entered Spain and they began to draw heavily from the Celtiberian military tradition, it was not even entirely Celtic, by the way. They adopted that kind of Hispanic design because it fit better their own already established tactics. You know that the Gladius Hispaniensis stems from this Spanish sword that would have been a hybrid between the local falcata and the Latin straight swords. And actually, when we think of the gladius, we always have this idea, for some reason, it was a sort of dagger. But if you look at, especially the earlier, I'm talking about the gladius hispaniensis type, those were actually pretty long blades, as actually the Romans and the Italics had somehow always used, that actually emphasized quite a dynamic and slashing fencing, and that we know, look at kynocephali, like chopping heads and limbs, that was really a pleasure, and that do not quite look like sort of short swords, as sometimes you still find described in some Roman military history books. Without mentioning one fact that I think is always dramatically underestimated, is that, as I was saying before, there were lots of other weapons used by the Romans and by their allies, and or by, say, their cavalry, for example. it seems, for instance, that the spada, right? So this essentially what stemmed just from the Latin type of sword, that was used by the Roman knights was always practically there, right? The length of the sword is actually what makes most of the thing. It's true that these swords had the barycenter heavily shifted towards the top, so they were slashing weapons, ideal for hitting from the top down on horseback, hence also some of the reason of the massive neck guards that the Celtic, sometimes of the later Celtic helmets eventually copied in design by the Romans were for. But that type of, say, concept had already been there among the, say, look at the warrior of Lanuvium, for example, and that was a horseman, also in that phase of Italic armor that is known as the, sort of the athletic one as well, because they were really something, right? It's still feudal Rome, about which I made a video explaining the warfare of, and that eventually were already and conceptually there. I mean, how many types of swords can you imagine? This is just to stop the swords, right? The same goes for the shields, for the thing, like the entire notion, again, that the Romans somehow copied their equipment, that the Romans basically had no original armament whatsoever, everything was a copy from other people's, is how did the Romans and the Italics ever differ from essentially Central Europeans as far as their equipment was concerned, even before the Romans adopted some relatively few designs actually from the Celts. The scutum is, aside from as a noble shield, like was used pretty much everywhere in Europe, but it was there from ever. Like we don't see any specific mutation from any people. Some even say that it was the Celts that actually took this sort of heavier equipment from the Italics, not the other way around, which in fact is not supported by any evidence. It may even be true when you consider that the Celts initially were not even particularly sensitive to larger swords, right? They began to develop them later, and this is the point, when their society began to be more feudal in nature. Otherwise, they preferred like long, sort of the sort of Saxes type of swords, right? This massive sort of chopping, thrusting, single-edged blades. And part of the reason being not that, of course, in their times that they did not have a full Bronze Age panoply, but that this was rarer in areas like the ones of Central Europe. So again, never, let's say, always look first of all at the average trooper in military cultures, not just at the top one, even if it's the best documented and all, because again, top technology doesn't necessarily even mean that it's being applied in a dramatic or fashion at, say, the average level, right, among the final rank soldiers. This is kind of obvious, but also in a deeper sense, right? How did eventually that military culture develop based on those technological achievements, right? Probably not much in general for any culture. And I explained this all over, for example, even in late medieval warfare, and all the prejudices that we have technologistically, materialistically, deterministically towards this kind of things. So, as you understand, there is a lot here to dig in, because essentially, especially the spada was always there. You can argue that ever since the Romans began to use that type of, also surely Celtic motivated sword, this never disappeared. It was always actually the prevalent weapon among the Roman cavalry, and even auxiliary cavalry. Not much just because the Celts were pretty damn active in the Roman army from an early age as auxiliaries, but because in general that worked, and Rome again could afford to arm different peoples with that too, even though the most of this auxiliaries qualities stemmed from just the habit, like when they were taken just from their own native warfare and generationally could just keep on fighting like that, right? Warriors do not change habits so easily, after all. They can easily adapt to different weapons, but if they can, they will stick to what they are more confident with. And then, of course, the Romans brought to an homogenization, the Roman Empire, its pacification, the gentrification brought to, as you know, also the loss of some military specialties that stemmed from ethnic, identities, right, of local warfare. Pliny tells us about steel imported as far as India, that, as you know, had quite a metallurgical tradition. They used the monsoons to fuel before hydraulic, siphons would be used, like insufflating air just naturally in this massive ovens to reach higher temperatures, and so getting some of the finest, some of the purest sort of combinations of metals for military purpose. And not only. Diodorus Siculus focuses his attention on metallurgical techniques and reports on the devices of the Celtiberians, who used a long and crude but not ineffective system of refining iron, so-called by corrosion. That is to say, they buried the blades so that the poorest part would rust, then they extracted them from the ground and reworked them. Later, the Celts discovered the technique of damask, that is, marbling, and were quite well informed about Celtic metallurgy, and in particular about the manufacture of swords in general, again in a non-precise but still substantial way, thanks to the rich archaeological finds and modern metallographic investigation techniques. The Celts were originally warlike people. They were quite successful in settling in different parts that could also initially sustain an important arms and armor production, just in material terms. And so we have a lot of burials that rendered us this kind of weapons at different times. Generally, these centers of extraction and those of metal transformation were the same. This tells you how the Celtic world was also, in spite of the broader trade networks, etc., fundamentally poor, like short-range base after all, and as a consequence, the exploitation of the mines, as we were hinting at before, had an actually superficial, episodic, and periodic nature. So again, not everything is always full gear, full intensity, full exploitation. The Celts were good at metallurgy, but in a qualitative sense, when as a warlike people who needed weapons, but overall they were still somehow primitive tribes, right? So they didn't have this enormous availability even of arms and armor just per se. In the videos, especially about the Celtic war bandsmen, we have seen how they, of course, at least the mercenaries serving Hellenistic powers and later also the Roman army were, of course, the ones who would have the best equipment available, because they were military professionals, essentially devoted religiously to a divinity to whom they belonged, and that as such were not even existing even as human beings anymore. They just spent their entire lives massacring people, expoliating them of their arms and armor, and when hired by even this richer civilizations, they were provided with extra weaponry, because they were just, that fanatically brave, and that's how they could be used fundamentally in these charges, and not expected to carry out particularly sophisticated maneuvers or whatever, but still they were good at that, right? And they were also relatively cheap compared to the quality, because they came from areas that were less developed, and so that would offer that not an excessive price that for them was already a big deal. But going back to Celtic mining and the relative poverty of the same, this was not only because of the rudimentary extraction procedures, but also because the metallurgy specialists appear to have been a relative rarity, as they were nomads, right? So the smiths were considered as a different type of people. There is all a religious meaning about that. I mean, the secrets of the earth, of its bowels, of the depths of the underworld, etc., were always seen as in a sort of sinister way. As we were saying before about the Indo-Europeans, those who worked, just anybody who worked, was considered inferior, right? The true man is only he who commends others. There are beautiful verses by Athenaeus describing the pride, the fierceness, and the prestige, right, of the Celtic warrior, as far as he would literally commend others, that he would sow his field with the tip of his spear, right, commending others, in an imperial, of course, universal idea of command over others, right? So for those also who whine about the terrible Roman Empire, right, this was the only traditional value existing. He who works is fundamentally a slave, is a lesser being, and it's your own majesty that brings power to you, right, and makes the world move, right? It's like in the Norse tradition, the Ragnarok, let's say the twilight of the gods is actually the cause of a curse, because the Aesir committed this crime of having the Asgard being built by the Nibelungs, so an inferior race of further, fallen people that, had created this beautiful world palace, let's say, but that had been, in fact, contaminated, right, desecrated by this lower kind. And so even the reliance on the crafts of these, because the Nibelungs are, as you know, in the cycle, the later story of the Epos, they are essentially the Burgundians. They're a race of heroes, or at least of men that were superior also to the dwarves, etc. But in other legions, let's say it's the Nibelungs who are the dwarves compared to the Aesir, right? And here it's pretty much the same. There was a sort of seductive prohibition about using something that was material as opposed to spiritual, that the heroes fall into because, say, of the dimming of the sacred in the heart of man, and so further decaying. It's just like Prometheus myth, right? And so these smiths were considered like some sort of darker. Just think of even working in the in their officines, all covered in smoke, or all this kind of stuff, and appearing and often actually belonging to the previous populations to the arrival of the Indo-Europeans, that were naturally more materially developed and that were, however, subjugated. And so the idea is that you could have them as servants, providing this great feats of technology to you, was still sort of a guilty pleasure that ideally a great warrior had not to indulge, except for the fact that eventually in warfare the elite would use this weaponry in the first place, right? And in the Celtic world, it seems like in others, by the way, traditionally, folkloristically, this was something even about gunners in late medieval, early modern times, etc. He lived very long in folklore. They were, first of all, a sort of closed, initiatory caste, and they had an isolated living, far from inhabited centers, in the mountains and in the forests, where there were the mines and coal mines to fuel their furnaces with, thus making them sort of actually distrusted population, that was more feared than admired, actually. Like, these peoples lived at the outskirts of civilizations that were dangerous, uncivilized, somehow even resentful, right, for their status, and yet they had this enormous knowledge of nature, of the earth, of these demons inhabiting in the same, and they would provide you, however, these excellent pieces of technology that were still somehow a divine blessing in the achievement itself, that required, again, in fact, a truly caste-like traditional legacy transmitted from father to son, also in very secret and jealous ways, because it's a bit like the Druids themselves, right? What Caesar says, that they didn't write down, even if the Celts had at some point, especially especially in the south, in Gaul, some Hellenic register, say, alphabet used for registers, etc. When the Helvetii moved, they made all a sort of a list of the stuff that they were bringing with them in Greek, etc. But the idea is that the Druids would, together with the Knights, maintain a bit the secret of this natural philosophy that did have, in fact, sort of an overlapping ground with the one of the Smiths, as far as especially arms and armor were concerned, because the rest of the people that, as we've seen, was increasingly, kept down by this ever more sort of proto-feudal elite, the knights, the equites, that Caesar calls in Latin, the Latin equivalent, and what in fact to keep for themselves. This is quite interesting. Naturally, the picture of the Smiths just being outcast, emarginated, is not entirely true. For example, in the same Gaul, where, as we've seen, this chthonic dimension was somehow more accepted even culturally, it is proven that blacksmiths enjoyed a higher reputation. For example, only a free man could be a blacksmith, after all. And once dead, his tools were placed next to him in the tomb, as it was used for warrior weapons, a symbol of status and prestige, and also of otherworldly connection. The smith's art and secret was, again, in direct contact with Druidic knowledge. The same woods and mountains that were their usual home were, moreover, sacred places themselves. Right? The mountains providing these mineral resources were thought, of course, to be magic, to have some intrinsic power held in them. And you know that, say, the Celtic burial mounds a bit were about that, right? The somatic element of the hero decomposed, while the spirit would have hopefully found his place in the firmament, waiting for this scatological reawakening, even through the same soma left underground, to the deities of hell that were to somehow, they were, however, necessary to be tamed by the virile Apollonian dimension to make the warrior transfigure in the first place, were becoming object of worship, right? The mounds with together with the, of course, arms and armor contained within them. So similarly, from like the idea of think about Excalibur coming back to the Dame of the Lake, so sort of the cyclical order that was meant to follow as far as the places of origin. So much so that in Ireland, as you know, many of these burial mounds would become seats of churches, because the pagan Goidelic warriors were essentially turned into Christian saints as a consequence, but the concept of sainthood was pretty much the same as far as the moral victory over the forces of evil. So everything actually makes sense in this. That the Celts were able to produce blades of pure and homogeneous iron since the so-called Latin I period, so roughly the 5th century BC, starting from that, as well as to empirically control the degree of carburization of the iron was evident from metallographic examinations. The existing trademarks on certain blades revealed that there was an intense trade in them, especially by that hierarchy, in that after the Roman conquest of Gaul and Noricum, production moved towards industrialized forms. Right, there are beautiful effigies of Gallo-Roman warriors. So these were surely, again, Romanized and or Romanizing Celtic nobility that were serving in the Roman army, say after the Roman conquest of Gaul. You can admire their equipment that at that point is indistinguishable also from the Roman one, because they used essentially the same armament, and that were contributing themselves as landowners, as just connected with druids, or being druids themselves at some point. As you know, Caesar and Cicero were friends with some of them. Augustus too met with them. There was just a general. Right now these people had been conquered. The elites were co-opted, and so that's how you would expect even the knowledge in arms and armor making being more, being further spread, absorbed by the Roman civilization. That needed, as we've seen, this more large-scale production, and in fact began to provide also with higher quality material her own troops. And again, some Celtic auxiliaries of Rome were nothing but the clients of those Gallo-Roman warlords themselves, so they would just fight their own way, right? Initially, not even changing much of their arms and armor, because it took a while before Rome would gradually be able to equip the auxiliaries in satisfactory ways, and these were already, say, active peoples as far as military organization was concerned. So that's how it all fits together. There is a controversy historiographically regarding what happened in late Roman times. I mean, it doesn't seem that throughout this time there was any significant change in quality of metallurgical techniques, right? But there is a general tendency later about, of course, material culture becoming poorer, right? There is no doubt that in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages there was a significant contraction in, let's say, in production. In part, this triggered further scientific technological research and innovation, especially the more Hellenic and so technologically biased East produced in Byzantine times some sort of significant improvements. But there is no doubt that society was changing, right, and that the state was also declining. And so that type of standardized equipment, especially available to large amounts of troops, was actually decreasing. We saw how the Romans were, in those very centuries, creating true statile militarized armories in the very heartland, by the way, of their Mediterranean possession, so away from the frontier, so barbarian invaders and provincial usurpers. So as far as the Roman field armies were concerned, the comitatenses, the top notch of the Roman military, well, at that point you still have significantly qualitative equipment, but for the rest, right, a bit from the Limitani, that sometimes were actually as well equipped as the comitatenses, if not more, but that generally speaking were just local military colonists, and also the Germanic federati that were also Celtic ones, telling the truth. We've seen it in the videos about the Battle of Strasbourg, or also the say whoever Rome fought against, they also used as mercenaries and soldiers, settlers, so becoming part of the game, right, and influencing one another, right. My estimation is that by the 6th century, fundamentally, the 7th at the latest, the homogeneity between the Roman and the Germanic troops was fundamentally achieved, right? For the simple reason that also the Roman society turned much more aristocratic, right? The Mediterranean oligarchies were much more powerful as long as late antiquity lasted than, say, the Germanic ones, that were, however, more militarized. Right? That's an important difference. And the Romans and the Germans at this point had been in direct contact with one another, even though we know that, say, contacts between Northern and Southern Europe had been going on forever. People think that even the Futhark runes were essentially derived from the Etruscan alphabet in some ways, in the early exchanges between northern Italy and Central Europe. But aside from this, the concept being that these military cultures, that especially in the last centuries had been fighting a lot against one another and for one another, had homogenized substantially. Right. This is the moment in which you can appreciate how both the Romans and the Germans were using the same weapons that, ironically, were all of somehow Celtic origin. I mean, the spada being the prototype of early medieval swords is nothing but essentially part of that ancient Central European panoply that the Celts had developed first in order to spreading among these other peoples. Right? This is already true from earlier times. I mean, the Germans already had Celtic arms and armor before they sort of entered in contact with the Romans militarily. So this is really notorious, and as much as how the Romans adopted, again, the Celtic designs and more advanced techniques, for their military purposes. The point is determining what was happening as far as the balance between these worlds was changing. Perhaps the biggest change in absolute terms was the fact that by late antiquity, the center of European metallurgy had shifted from Noricum to the Upper Rhine, right? And this would remain essentially until the High Middle Ages, when it would shift to Lombardy. But essentially throughout all the early Middle Ages, what you have is that the best swords produced, and not just those, as an armament, in Europe, at least in the broader Latin Germanic world, were from the Rhineland. Right, the Vikings used Frankish blades. The Carolingian Empire, of course, spread further this sort of more feudal kind of armament, right? And this is the key of it all, right? In late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, society changed, importantly enough, towards a further aristocratization. This is showed also by the increased importance of cavalry, that essentially by the 6th century, 6th, 7th surpasses infantry de facto in importance. It's not decisive, yet it will not be decisive until the second half of the 12th century, and will stay decisive only for until the early 14th century. So remaining maintaining the upper hand until fundamentally the second half of the 15th. The point being, though, that the military reflection of this would contemplate, first of all, a greater importance of cavalry, and as such, of a greater importance of the mounted elite, that was relying ever more on swords of like the spada, because of the excellent compromise that it offered as far as this mostly mounted but also dismounted warfare in Western Europe would provide, right? We will talk about how this was similar also in the Byzantine world. That wasn't just about something else. Like it doesn't make much sense to try to distinguish a 6th century Longobard Arimanus from a Byzantine Caballarius of the same period, right? Also because sometimes they could be literally the same person from the imperial side, but the meaning being that there had been some sort of homogenization, mostly on a social basis, and the military result was the revived need of what had been historically Celtic designs, right? Naturally adapted to the circumstances, but fundamentally the same. This is particularly relevant, right? And there is a debate whether at that point the Celts were really not very much around, just like in the Celtic fringe in Western Europe, right? But northern Spain, northwestern Gaul, the British Isles, that's pretty much it. There is an important Celtic legacy, culturally, historically, in many areas, including some of which the Germanic military had a better, development, such as the Gallo-Roman world, right, with the Franks. And given that peoples like the latter had de facto taken over the western half of the Roman Empire, one may wonder, was there a substantial difference between the Germanic and the Roman blades in late antiquity? In other words, did the Germans or the Romans have the best weapons? My impression, honestly, is that they were probably comparable. There may have been an actual Germanic edge, but we must also see, in fact, what we mean by Romans and by Germans, what kind of states were using what, right? Because there is really a lot, for example, of Roman arsenals or even imperial units that really kept serving under the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, as much as Germanic troops used as the armies of even countries like Italy at large. Think about Odoacer's troops, war bands. So it's very difficult to answer this question objectively, right? And the question should be at that point, right? Were the best weapons produced, as we've seen the Upper Rhine, but that was essentially now becoming a Frankish dominated area, and it will remain so. And but say, how much would that weaponry spread? And given that there were still Roman armories, say for example in Ostrogothic use, right? Which swords were better? Say at that point, a Frankish one and an Ostrogothic one, and wasn't it still somehow there's some sort of Romanity involved? We unfortunately don't have the data to actually answer this question easily, right? It's also difficult whether, say, the late antique fold there had anything to do with the quality of weapons, right? Surely the type of swords that the Romans and the Germans used throughout their own altercations, let's put it this way, during the centuries, were practically always the same, and again, always essentially the spada, right? Especially by late antiquity, right? And the point here is also that technology doesn't give you the edge per se. So good luck with trying to calculate arms and armor production, say in the 5th and the 6th century, and who used what there. there is surely a collapse of production on a large-scale basis. The migration era was not really a happy period for anyone, right? Everybody was sharing a condition of overall misery, right? Either by falling standard like the Romans, but in that sense, in absolute terms, in a way that was not different from those Germans who succeeded in settling the same Roman land, where, for not talking about those who still lived in Central or Northern Europe, where evidently swords were a rarer commodity for the average warrior, right? But again, it's as if differences were flattening to at least the degree of availability. There is another factor, that is to say that apparently Mediterranean populations had been sort of exhausted morally, the sense that the Roman had become a sort of colonist, living as de facto as a serf in the latifundia that had been so demilitarized, right, and somehow not particularly, into weapons like, I don't know, most semi-nomadic Germans would be, just for the needs of the migration, right, that required sort of level of militarization. And so it is true that even the average Germanic warrior was really a thing, right? In perspective, the Romans used still lots of these guys. There were also other mercenaries from the steppes. Think about the Huns and more. Probably shouldn't underestimate even the level of Roman, let's say, military standards and also armament in a general sense, meaning that civilization did not disappear or even, fell to the same level of, say, Central Europe during the early Middle Ages. It was still, the Mediterranean was still a substantially more advanced place. This is notorious, like that the same Italian peninsula would not be surpassed in wealth until the 17th century, but in the second half of it by the Dutch, by the British. So there is a tradition that basically stresses the idea that the Germans had better weapons. We will see now why. It's said that in the British Isles from the 5th century AD, so when essentially the Romans bailed out the local population, as you know, there was a pretty messy revolution fundamentally, that we also don't have it documented very well, but well before the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, there was a substantial redrawing of the of the land, property, things like that. The general decline, also the Celtic fringe that was keeping to harass the Romanized part, never taking it over satisfactorily, by the way, seemed to have influenced the general British iron working, according to older, in that case also more primitive, Celtic fashion, sort of pre-Roman tradition if you want, even though it's not really clear by which degree we should consider this just like much of an accomplishment. The idea is that if you live in a more clanic, militarized society, you gravitate around a lord of some sort. Think about Excalibur, made a video about, still have about the British Sarmatians, and they were stationed there, this history of, again, the mound, the sword in the stone, and so on. So, But this is because most of the people now could not sustain like a state that could arm them in some sort of more homogeneous fashion, and still by good standards after all. Again, it's like what happened with the Romans and the Celts later. I mean, before this, it's the idea that just say a Gallic champion could have posed a significant challenge to an individual Roman legionnaire, right? But the majority of the Gallic forces were just guys with a spear, a shield, and a couple of javelins, right? And they were not military professionals, differently from the noblemen. So this and the Romans, of course, took over the entire system. So it's not really, again, a civilizational accomplishment to have per se come back to that only. If anything, it was just like a shrinking with an internal imbalancement that eventually was established for good, basically until really the nation state, in many ways at least, well, from a military point of view, it ended towards the Renaissance, but it still was based on the same political and social premises. The same Roman one, it originally had been like that, but the more you approximate something like a state, and the more, of course, qualitative the military as a whole, there had been undoubtedly a demographic and economic decline in the age of the Völkerwanderung. So there was no such mass production and armament availability as before, right? What does happen is, of course, swords remain around. It's not like there are also different types of blades. Seriously, now think about this Kramas axe as a secondary weapon. That, aside from all the reasons why it had come about, you could find also a sort of functionalization of a more composites panoply to some degree. But the average guy was, yes, maybe had just that, right? Surely not a spada for that matter, right? The weapons tended to become, if not all, at least, again, the top ones, a luxury product. Expertly finished and very expensive, right? The again, greater availability for the average trooper of a gladius was not quite there anymore. The cingulum militaris became the same indicator of aristocracy and true freedom and nobility, whereas the rest of the population was gradually going under. Among the same peoples that actually had, let's say, this Germanic world that initially was that more cohesive and compact, like the elites eventually take over, also in the non-Romanized areas. So this is ever more even, and in the Romanized ones, and especially in the Gallic one, part also in the Visigothic one, you realize that cavalry has really a feudal tendency, right, at some point. There were, again, peoples like the Goths, the Longobards, that had a bit that sort of more equestrian renown. The Franks historically were actually had less cavalry than these other populations. But gradually, since mostly they inherited the Gallo-Roman latifundia, and they blended in the local aristocracy themselves, senatorial and episcopal alike, the Franks eventually developed the best cavalry, the truly professional one, because really very few guys had an enormous amount of land just under their control. Hence what you see not just in Carolingian but also in Merovingian times, as far as the development of the heavier sort of medieval knightly cavalry that we all sort of relate to in different ways, in many ways especially, really was born. Right. There are many reasons for that. Again, I made my share amount of videos about the Franks, but we must come back on them. Also a bit about the Goths, because we know relatively few. After all, it's just, especially the latter had a shorter history, right, and some sort of more dramatic one than the Franks. But the comparisons, like in the way they, just the other day I was talking about the Gothic Constitution by Harrington, and so the idea that at least the Goths were associated with, just in a legendary sort of historical sense, as those who brought down Rome, except that's not actually what happened. But they had a hell of an equestrian tradition, and also from quite significantly mixed influences, at least, and so that is worth observing, right? But there is no doubt that pretty much all over Europe you have the long sword taking over, right? Using this slashing, irresistible force from the top down, this aristocratic weapon suitable for striking, right? And so effectively from horseback. And there is also an earlier tradition highlighting the capacity of the spada from the same Celtic tradition. Diodorus Siculus, for example, speaks of the long sword of the Gauls, right? This was already noticed as the fearsome. The blacksmiths had difficulty in forging it, even for how special it was, right? The problem was doing so for large masses of iron that had to be forced properly if they wanted to produce such a long blade. It's a reason for which, essentially, for the technology of the time, also double-handed swords were not quite there, right? Surely they existed, but they must have been so rare and impractical for that kind of world, even, that we don't really see them as a thing. So the practice was the juxtaposition of small quantities of iron by welding of the metal in layers, so that the product could take on a leaf-like structure. But the Celtic, and that's where you see, because it would be better to say at this point, rather Gallo-Roman innovation had consisted, in fact, in imperial times, in the use no longer of forged iron, but rather of tempered steel. It was certainly semi-soft, or at most semi-hard steel, and it was not possible to obtain hard steel, and the hardening operations themselves were not very effective. They were experimenting that, right? The results, however, had been notable, right? And that's how the Celtic technique was passed down to the Romans, that even implemented on it. This is a very important aspect to observe too, because they did so for basically any military technology that they had adopted, or also fully integrating it in that hell of military that they had. But it was also passed down to the Germans as such. I would like also to point out that, as we will see now, the point, that is to say, again, the more elitistic society, of course, the better the weapons of that elite is, but how strong is that elite and that people for such reason? We will talk about it now, because there are interesting comparisons between even different Germanic peoples as far as that equipment, right, is concerned. But the idea really being that the Germans adopted already a quite enhanced type of technology, right? The Romans had to acknowledge that as this warlike peoples that had taken over their world were displaying such magnificent pieces, right? Very famous is Cassiodorus praising of the Gothic swords at the time of Theodoric, right? We know that there were also quite intense traffics, metal, weapons trade, etc. And the Goths were obsessed by culture, just like the Germans in general, with the greatness of the swords that, as we discussed in other videos at length, they were loaded with enormous sacred value, etc. The Roman world had not been so, let's say, oligarchic after all, at least as far as the availability of so many troops and so well equipped was concerned. Of course, it was always an oligarchic world, but in that sense, you would have the soldiers being soldiers, right, and being the best, right? The Celtic, the Germanic world didn't quite have that level of widespread professionalism, so to them, to their elite, this war seemed like, first of all, the alter ego of the heroes, right, and quite literally so, the symbol of their virility, etc., but also, in fact, the proof of whether, they were strong or not, in fact, whether they could wield this or not. And for peoples that traditionally had been all about warfare constantly, with their elites really involved in finding a path through Europe in order to reach the Mediterranean, settling in the better land, had been a bit like the symbol of this entire universal cosmic struggle, right? And in Ostrogothic Italy, you have that literature praising the weapons of the gods. Of course, it's a courtly literature of late antiquity, so it's obviously encomiastic, and it overly stresses the excellence of these swords for flattering the masters. But there is also some consistency to it, right? Consider that the Goths had been among the Sarmatians, the Iranian peoples that were the ones that, as we've seen, had developed actually because they were the most warlike of all in the steppes, and even equestrianly, and so the best swords makers, the most knightly ones. Again, the Sarmatian knights were a bit the prototype of the same medieval one. And this surely had brought a lot. Surely the Visigoths were much more, say, Romanized than the Ostrogoths for that regard. But in general, the Getzius also had no doubts about that. The sources, epic, chronicle, archaeological, agree in testifying that the frightening wounds inflicted by the short and straight single-edged weapons called skirmish axe, for example. There is a very interesting work by Sanan that confirms the stories of Ammianus Marcellinus and Gregory of Tours about the terrible wounds produced by this weapon, exhibiting, by the way, even the proofs, right, of the actual photos of the skulls affected by the wounds of this kind, and they are really, right, impressive in many ways. Of course, a late Roman, a Constantinian equus, let's put it in this way, would have surely been able to cut people to pieces with the same deadly efficiency. Yeah, but also in that case, we're talking of an elite, right? I would like to conclude this video, however, noticing one interesting aspect. Of course, the sword, this battle would go on essentially until throughout for a good half of a millennium further. Then it would evolve even in something more complex and larger from the High Middle Ages. But we're talking also about a world that was, in fact, would re-expand afterwards and would complement also the figure of the dominating knight with, deadly weapons of other kinds. The paradigm has changed. But just to stick to the 6th century, there is an interesting comparison between a people who had essentially a very strong bulky freemen. It was, as a consequence, very cohesive, and one that was very rich, but mostly, as far as the elite was concerned, in fact owned most of the wealth, while the rest of the people were sinking in, say, in the social ladder. We're talking about the Longobards and the Gepids, respectively. I talk about both in some of my videos. And the simple lesson to be learned here is that aside from the Avars that knocked at the eastern Gepid door while they were fighting against the Longobards, who were incidentally allied, with the steppes knights, we know that the Longobards finally crushed the Gepids and also deported a significant amount of them together in their journey to Italy. Is that, in fact, the Longobard graves, because of the social characteristics exhibited before, had a much greater frequency in Spate, while in the Gepid burials, essentially only the elite had them, and only very few freemen that were likely not that freer than a Longobard Arimanes had. Right, so you can think that on the battlefield, yes, you would have, again, a Longobard people that also suffered some defeat from the Gepids at times, but finally was victorious, likely not because they had more swords, right, but because they were more cohesive. And so through that amount, that distribution, you can appreciate how successful a people was, right? Whereas the Gepids, we had just very few well-armed troops, but probably in a sclerotic society that did not function pretty well, ended up crushed and fundamentally cancelled from history. I think this is a good example of what it means to look at the migration here, which was not really a pleasant period, again, for everybody involved. It did not really end particularly well, except for those who managed to survive and restart from from that level of safety they had reached. They had managed to preserve, at least. And that brought definitely to the beginning of a new military dimension, through which, however, there had been a substantial amount of that sort of proto-feudal Celtic, say, military culture that would be kind of matching the later sort of, or especially, in fact, later feudal, medieval feudal knightly dimension that you could see together with, again, the also the Iranian injections from the steppes and this Romano-Germanic form, the continuation of the same, right? And so that's as far as Celtic material culture more goes, right, in very technical terms, and how important really it was for all these peoples, right, which we really want to appreciate in general. There would be really a lot to say about all these topics, because after all, we tend to neglect them a bit. Like, it's difficult to give a quantity, as we've seen in this video. We tend to, of course, be partisan. We tend to be more or less, prone to some sort of, polemic regarding this topic. But all in all, we're really looking at a different time in values, right, that we must accept before even thinking of the material side of the story, because this is what these peoples didn't really care about too much themselves. I mean, they did because they knew much better than us what was the value of matter, but exactly for that they knew how it was objectively, because they knew also much more how the spirit was important. And this can't be quite equivocated, if not, say, essentially distorting history and making it a bit like a history of engineering rather than especially warfare, which is instead what really interests us here. Reason for which I hope we will keep talking about these topics. I have now a significant amount of arms and armor videos that I'm each very proud of, right? And that also about the Celts, right? We are accumulating enough, and again, this mostly comes randomly through my cyclical, say, whatever comes out that I want to discuss, from the pool of info that I can draw from, and so I hope that we will keep replenishing again those playlists and being really ever more interested in these topics, because and be more complete, right? Because there is really a lot, sort of too much of what should be covered. Sometimes I find horrendous gaps within the sort of topics that I thought, oh my god, I thought enough about this topic instead for covering this other, I skipped it, etc. But it's just random. Again, the more we go on, important is to maintain this constancy in the way I make videos. That is really what allows for all this material to accumulate. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.